theological seminary. Before I get into this message, I wanted to also say it's a joy to be here in honor of this lecture series. Theologians are a gift to help us give voice to some pretty complex things, right, that we wrestle with Scripture and theology. But before I jump in, there's one thing that I want you to hear from me today. That you are loved by God. You are known by God. You may feel at times like God is royally messing with your life. And I just want to tell you that God will mess with your life because he loves you and he knows what you want more than you do. And the reason I am so strong about this message is that I have personally lived this deeply and walked deeply with God in these things. So know that you are loved today. If you hear nothing else, that is what I want you to know. So as I was praying about today, about this talk, thinking about this season of life you are in, there's a part of the story at Ruth that just sort of started to emerge and bubble up for me. And it's at the end of chapter 1 where this really begins to come into focus. There's this transition from this grand decision from the woman Ruth into chapter 2. So in a strange way, my text today is not a text, it's this in-between chapter time. So she makes this grand commitment, and then she's in this awkward new space. And I'll be focusing on this transitional space today. Have you ever found yourself in this sort of space where you've had all this time and energy making a big commitment, and then after the decision was made, say to start college, a new job, a new ministry, and then the questions begin. Was this the right decision? This didn't exactly turn out as I imagined. Well, I have been there. When I first began teaching at George Fox University way back in 2011, this was a super new, awkward space for me. I didn't grow up a church kid. I didn't know the Bible stories when I went to undergrad, where you all are. I remember somebody asking me about Moses, and I'm like, I don't know who that is. So it's just this interesting space. So at this point, even though by the time I was learning to, becoming a professor and teaching at George Fox, I had a master's in Old Testament at that point, but it was still a really awkward space. I didn't know how awkward it was until I found myself in a more homey space. Has this happened to you? My homey moment happened when I was pulled up at a gas station in Dundee, Oregon. And in Oregon, you don't pump your own gas, they pump it for you. And the gas attendant started droning on and on about something, and you have to know this about me. I grew up in Napa, California, and my parents owned a 7-Eleven for 12 years. So I get that, like sipping Slurpees, at the 7-Eleven. And this guy started going on and on about the band Metallica. Do some of you know this band? Yeah. And he's so mad. He's like, bleepity bleep bleep, Metallica went all corporate, And all of a sudden, I had this rush of like warm fuzzies, like a blanket. I'm like, my people. And so, it was like, wow, I'm home in this moment. And so, all this stuff, it was just hilarious. It was cracking me up because, I'm ready to sing. Sleep with one eye open, this song, gripping your pillow tight. Anyways, so this is when I realized a major shift was happening in my life from known space, like my people, to new people in the academy. So in Ruth, we have chapter 1 and then chapter 2. The threshold between chapter 1 and chapter 2 is where I'm going to focus. So within this threshold bubbles up questions. And I really believe that Ruth lives these questions. Let me create the scene for you. In Ruth 1, in the days the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in this country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. They went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. One was Orpah, the other Ruth. After they lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So Ruth's story begins with tragedy. The main women are 3 widows. The 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, are Moabites. These people were considered outsiders in Israel, not looked upon fondly. And Naomi, the mother-in-law, is an Israelite. So she urges the women, go home to the house of your mother. There you can remarry, start over, start a new life. Orpah ends up returning home, but Ruth has other plans. In fact, she's quite bold. She resists her mother-in-law's request and vows to stick with her. So we go to the next slide. These threshold moments. Ruth says, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death separates me from you. And when Naomi saw she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So Ruth was determined. This word determined describes power and resilience. I want to point out that this is just not a stubborn daughter-in-law. Ruth's oath is interesting in light of other oaths within the Old Testament. In fact, this is the only time an oath of this magnitude is ever spoken by a woman. All other oaths like this are men in powerful positions. A close example is Jonathan's oath to David in 1 Samuel 20:13. Both Ruth and Jonathan have given up a possible future for another. Both oaths, I'm like starting to talk about oatmeal. Both oaths invoke the covenant name of God. For Jonathan and David, Jonathan is forfeiting his right to rule and have succession as a king, giving allegiance to David. For Ruth, she's risking a future with her people to return to a foreign land where she is pledged to be with Naomi in a covenant similar to like a marriage contract. This woman is bold, a woman of incredible agency. She invokes the covenant name of God. She proclaims how she will live and then also how she will die. I imagine Ruth growing up a really strong kid, a leader. Do you know these type of kids? Maybe you are one of those kids. One of my favorite stories is about a strong toddler from John Ortberg's book, The Me I Want to Be. He shares the story of this 4-year-old girl named Shauna. She loved riding her tricycle. Her mom is getting a little bit exhausted, is thinking, all right, I need to get some things done. So little Shauna is on her tricycle and she says, okay, I'm going to give you boundaries. You can ride your trike on the sidewalk, but in between the driveway and the tree. Don't go past these boundaries or you will get a spanking. Shauna then rides her little trike up, points to her rear and says, you might as well spank me now because I've got places to go. Yes, I really think Ruth was a Shauna. My son is a Shauna. I have a 16-year-old son and a 19-year-old daughter. I get this. Might as well spank me now. So they consider, weigh the costs, and say, yes, this is a hard decision, but it's worth it. Leaders. So Naomi gives in. I'm not going to get into it with this Ruth, this Shauna. So the two of them went on. So this is next. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her. When they returned to the country, returned from Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So they journeyed to Bethlehem, to this small town where Naomi is from. The town is buzzing with news that Naomi has returned. Now, are any of you from small towns? A few of you, right? Small towns are very interesting. We know how they work. It can take years to get accepted, if ever in some. You sometimes hear people say things like, oh, Johnny, he came in like 3rd grade. He's not one of us. So I'm joking, but you can imagine Ruth returning to this small town as an outsider, not only because of when she moves in, but she's also a Moabite. So here we have them returning. The town exclaims, "Could this be Naomi, the women of Bethlehem?" See, these women are in the know, maybe like the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association. Don't mess with those. Or like the Real Housewives of Bethlehem. So the women are all abuzz. Could this be Naomi? And then here we have Ruth, right? Naomi has just declared how empty her life is, how the Lord has afflicted her. And Ruth has just pledged this oath, pledged her life to Naomi. And Naomi doesn't mention Ruth. For Naomi, she's returned home. But for Ruth, she's just left home. She knows no one. This is a new land, new custom. She's an outsider. This is Ruth's threshold. This is her unfinished story. So the threshold, next slide. The word threshold itself already has this metaphorical meaning in everyday usage, together with its literal meaning, and it's connected with this breaking point of life, the moment of crisis, this decision that changes a life, or the indecisiveness to change a life, the fear to step over a threshold. In literature, the chronotype of the threshold, or the time-space, is always metaphorical and symbolic, sometimes pretty openly and other times more implicitly. So Ruth has just crossed this major threshold with Naomi. And as you can see, Naomi's not exactly a peachy woman to be around. She's bitter. She even renames herself, right? She's grieving. There's this identity shift. And I can't help but wonder, what was that like for Ruth? Did she begin to have doubts about her commitment? New town, new people. When the dust begins to settle and the hard work of providing, being vulnerable in places as a field worker where she would gather grain, and as a woman and a widow, were there moments that she wanted to just go home? To go tell Naomi, I should have listened to you and gone back to my family. These are the threshold moments when nothing is happening and yet everything is about to happen, when doubts become loud, when there are more questions than answers. These moments of saying yes in the mundane and to keep following God when it's not exciting or clear, these, I want to encourage you, are where roots begin to deepen, when we begin to change, when the everyday ordinary becomes extraordinary. This is the space I want to encourage you in today, the threshold space between chapter 1 and chapter 2, the big decision that happens in the light, and then the questions that start to come in the dark. In one sense, right, all of our stories are not finished. Some of you may be in difficult thresholds of these in-between times of waiting. Ancient writers have described this space with the wilderness theme as ways to describe our journeys, the landscapes of our lives. So not only do mountains take on rugged significance, but the wilderness does as well. The desert, the valley, often sometimes these are called liminal spaces, these in-between spaces. I imagine for Ruth being in a new town, everyone was aware, and she didn't just come in third grade, right? Her origin story screams outsider, not one of us. The story reminds us several times throughout the story that she is other. The cards are stacked against her: Moabite outsider, widow, and a woman. Okay, and then the next slide, it talks about this threshold topography. Fierce landscapes remind us that what we long for and what we fear most are already within us. Another way of saying this is the desert and mountain terrain provokes the identification and reordering of boundaries. It confronts people with their edges. In desert and mountain wilderness, people discover liminal places, suggesting thresholds between where they've been and where they're going. In Ruth's story, she would never have known how her faithfulness in these threshold moments, her commitment to Naomi, the risk she took to figure out life in a new town, would have had the impact that it did generations later. Like her crazy faithful love to Naomi, it's this hesed love, this covenant love, meant that these women who began absolutely destitute would later become monumental, carrying into the lineage of Jesus. All they knew at this point was life in a small town, widows, figuring it out in a very desperate situation. And in the next slide, it talks about in wilderness extremity. People find themselves running out of language, Ordinary speech seems inappropriate. Mountain and desert people, they don't talk much. Their words are measured by the leanness of the land. And in short, the liminality of desert and mountain terrain redefines every boundary, giving shape to one's life. And this is it. The chaos of uncertainty can cause us to doubt God's leading and wonder if we really can trust God with our lives. Boundaries become redefined in these spaces. I want to share with you one of my threshold moments and boundary shifting seasons. We were in Canada, our whole family. When we moved up there, we had a 10-month-old and a 3.5-year-old. It was a couple years later, we had sold everything to move to Canada. And then we went up there to go to graduate school. We had our master's degree in hand, and we were like, where to next? There seemed to be nowhere to go. And I won't share all the details, but during that time, I actually stopped praying. In a waiting season, praying gets really hard. You get stripped of what you used to know. I thought, you get a degree and then a job, right? Isn't that how it works? So isn't that the next normal step? We had a moving truck scheduled, but we're not able to give them a destination. Did you know you can schedule a moving truck and be moving in a month and they don't need to know where it's going? I found that out. And so this was a really intense time. 2 kids waiting, months and months of waiting. So during this threshold time, this wilderness extremity, I began praying again and talking to Jesus. Jesus asked me one question. And what I mean by this is that being in a relationship with God is sharing life with God, right? Being fully myself, fears and all, knowing I'm forgiven, messing up, knowing God loves me, and learning to trust more each day. The question, he repeated a few times, because I needed to struggle with it. This was the question, am I enough? Well, yes, Jesus, of course you are, but we also need jobs to pay for things like house and food and, And again, Jesus would look at me, or in my heart, right? Am I enough? So for me, this time began to strip away things I was clinging to. I was finally able to completely let go and say, yes, Jesus, you're enough. And yes, Jesus, I will follow you where you lead me, even if it doesn't make sense. And yes, even though I want my kids to never experience hardship and want, I know you love them, and I'll trust you with my kids. But I don't want to, because I'm the mother that you made me, that mother bear side of me. Yeah, you created that. So, this is a little hard. But I want to challenge you. But yes, you're God. I will trust you. So this waiting time in the wilderness, this time of being refined, prepared us for what was next. And I honestly don't think I would have been prepared for the ministry of church planting in Oregon if God had not allowed me to wrestle in that space, that landscape, that liminal space, that threshold moment. Was God farther away during that time? God felt farther. He felt absent from my story. But here's what's true. What I feel and perceived was not true. God was with me just as much in those moments as when God feels close. What is true? I am not alone. Did I feel alone? Yes, but I was not alone. Here is one of my boundaries that was being reordered. What I thought I needed and what I truly needed, I needed Jesus. And Jesus would again prove to be faithful beyond my wildest expectations. Boundaries are redefined in this space. God is with us. We're not alone in our journey. Ruth is a powerful example of God working out redemption on multiple levels. We can celebrate that God is moving through chaos toward beautiful new beginnings, taking broken areas and disappointments and shaping them into places of restoration, wholeness, and healing. Ruth learns to live the questions, to move forward into the unknown. Her example can be encouraging when the fear of uncertainty and doubt creep in. Okay, next slide. When we are drawn geographically to the remote edges of our world, we are carried metaphorically to the edges of ourselves as persons, invited to an emptiness as exhilarating as it is frightening, encountering overwhelming fierceness at the end of all possibilities. In this space, you know yourself to be loved in wild and unanticipated grace. So what felt like an end, the edges of our worlds, becomes a place of new beginnings. This has been a reoccurring theme for me in my own life. And I want to encourage you today that even though you can't see what's ahead, God is turning the pages of your story. The page may feel like it's being turned very slowly, but take encouragement, you are in God's story. Ruth could not have known what was next. I don't want to leave you in her threshold moment forever, so we can quickly peek into the next 2 chapters. There are the mundane things to keep doing in these kind of thresholds, waiting spaces. Finding food, Ruth goes to work in the fields, a vulnerable and dangerous place for a single woman. She happens upon the field of Boaz and finds a safe place to gather food. Ruth is a hard worker. This does not go unnoticed. Boaz offers her a safe place to gather food and loads her up with extra grain. When Ruth returns that night, Naomi is like, wow, where in the world did you get all that? I'm kind of improvising. That's not really in the text. But Ruth begins to share this incredible story about Boaz. And Naomi is like, he's a potential redeemer for our family. So then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed according to the Lord, who has not left his hesed, this covenant love, with the living and the dead, those that we've lost. That man is our close relative. He is a kinsman redeemer. So what is this hesed love of God? Let me try to define it. I won't do well. It's very hard to. It's definitely more than, oh, that's nice, that's kind. It's a term that refers to salvation, preservation of life, the love of humanity towards God and one another. It's the covenant-loving kindness of God's faithfulness to us. Naomi's wheels start turning. A plan is coming. She tells Ruth that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, and there's a flicker of hope in Naomi's eyes. Maybe life won't remain empty. So in the culture at this time, it's important to hold on to land and keep the memory of your family going. And this was the kinsman redeemer role. Land and identity and memory are all tied together. So the kinsman redeemer role was to take on the family, and in do so, the land would remain with Naomi's family, honoring those who have died, who can't care for the living. So I imagine this scene like a football coach, Naomi getting out the board, trying to show Ruth how to make a play for this Boaz, right? You know these types. Do you have friends like this? Yeah, getting your Valentine's Day, be careful. So I can imagine Ruth thinking, okay, so I'm like totally reading creatively right now, but he's not bad looking. He's got some land, and he has most of his teeth. Sorry. So this is not in the text, but I like to imagine things creatively. So I have to share this story because we're getting near Valentine's Day, and to prove that, yes, teeth do cross minds, and they might have crossed Ruth's. So 2 years ago, we were living in Sonoma, California. I'm driving, listening to the Christian radio station. So this man had called in the day before describing, like, if I had a girlfriend on Valentine's Day, this was the scenario, what I would do. So he's like, I'd buy her flowers, I'd make her dinner, give her a foot massage. I'm like, there's even like too many details that I don't really want to hear. And it kind of was surprising to me that it was on this Christian radio station. Next day, a woman calls in, and she asked the guy's name, and I'm shocked, and they like actually gave it to her, because Christian stations don't usually do this dating scene thing. They mentioned his name, but then they asked her, what are you looking for in a man? I was not prepared for her response. She said, her voice full of hope, I want him to be a Christian and to have teeth. I literally started laughing out so loud I had to pull the car over. This woman must have been living in a liminal space and waiting for some time if her list got that short. I think she discovered her non-negotiables. So boundaries do shift in these waiting spaces. Clarity is given. Similar to, but more serious than the woman's dating list, man with teeth. Ruth is in this threshold space, about to take a risk at the urging of Naomi, to approach this Boaz, the one who owns the field, and ask him to be a kinsman redeemer. These women chose him. The fact that Ruth is sent to approach him at night, in a vulnerable time and place, on the threshing floor, in this opened outdoor space, One of the shifts I love in this story is what is expected and then what actually happens. Naomi instructs Ruth to lie down next to Boaz at night after he's been eating and drinking. And Naomi tells Ruth, Boaz will tell you what to do. I'm like she's gruffy. And there's these strange customs Ruth agrees to. If Boaz accepts the role, there's a chance they'll get back, right? Their land and family. But then the plan has this unusual twist. This very provocative scene in Ruth 3, Boaz falls asleep, probably not part of the plan, and he's shocked to find this woman at his feet. His mind must have been racing. But then rather than Boaz telling Ruth what to do, Ruth tells Boaz what to do. And she basically asks for two requests. And it pays off to be kinsman redeemer and for marriage. And as the story unfolds, Boaz and Ruth end up getting married and having a baby, Obed. And what they didn't know was that this baby Obed would be the father of Jesse, who's the father of David. King David, writer of most of the Psalms, the king who went down in Israel as Israel's greatest king in history, second only to his later ancestor Jesus. Matthew 1 lists this genealogy: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then in verse 5, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab the prostitute, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of King David. Then verse 16, Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. So what happened to Ruth through these threshold moments? One amazing shift through the story is how she is views herself early on. A lot of the Hebrew terms as she uses for herself is that she's less than a servant, ineligible for marriage. By the end of the story, Boaz calls her by the same term he's described, a woman of valor, of strength, and a shet hayil. In these spaces, our identities shift. We can feel like outsiders, less thans. When things begin to strip away and the truth begins to surface, God has not abandoned us. Our true identity is that we are loved children of God. How is God with us? The next image is one I want to share. Just that one right there is perfect. Is that God holds us in our threshold places. We may not feel it all the time, but God's love for you is beyond words. Israel doubted God in all these threshold moments. They even accused God of wanting to harm them. Did you bring us into the desert to kill us, right? Have you forgotten us? Are we alone? These are the questions when we feel afraid, the questions that bubble up when God feels far away. Do you know God's response in Deuteronomy? He says, I carried you as a parent carries their child. During critical threshold moments, all throughout the Old Testament, there's one thing that God will remind his people: I am with you. And I love this picture because when I first ran across it, it just brought tears to my eyes, this sense of being held, even if we don't perceive it, that God has us this close. Waiting is a hostile place, right? But God is with us. And Jesus says in Matthew 28:20, I am with you always. So in this liminal space, this great in-between, where we would traverse from known space to unknown space, God reveals how he was with his people Israel, even with small families like Ruth and Naomi, and how I believe with us now as a parent carries their child. This image is the one that I cling to, God carrying us tenderly and carefully with great love. So here's the secret. You can't prepare and train for all these threshold moments, but you can trust that God will carry you as a parent carries their child. In your theme this year, whatever you do, it talks about the hope that we don't have to lead fragmented lives. Colossians tells us, it says, that Jesus holds all things together. So when we locate ourselves in the name of Jesus, he holds us together and the rest of creation along with us and makes us whole. We are held together in the hands of God. Right now, what I'd like to do is to give you a few moments of silence to just think or journal and just reflect on these two questions. The first is, are you in a threshold moment right now? And if so, what are you learning about yourself and about God? Earlier I mentioned times when we do not sense God's presence, and then we later realize that God has been carrying us. So my next question is, have you had moments like this in your journey? And if you can hit the next slide, it should have the questions up. So just to take a few moments and to think about these questions. And then I'll come back and pray, and then we will close with a final song.
Thanks for joining us for chapel today. Be sure to check back every Tuesday and Thursday for our next gathering.